In this video, we'll be exploring the topic of people and place for the decedent population, finding out about the size of the decedent population, its structure in terms of age and gender, about causes of death and place of death. Also about access to healthcare and examining end-of-life pathways. I'll be talking through some of the key analysis from our report, using the Midlands as an example. But all this information is available by STP in the STP level reports, and these also show STP comparisons to the Midlands. This is the second video in a series of 4, taking a short look at the key theme of people and place from our report on end-of-life care in the Midlands. The full report for individual STPs and also a regional version are available at www.strategyunitwm.nhs.uk. And if you have any comments or queries, please feel free to get in touch. Before we look at the analysis, I just really want to briefly mention the data that's underpinning all of our end-of-life care report. We have access to mortality data, which is the information that's collected when a person dies and their death is registered. And we know from this that there were just over 93,500 adult deaths in the Midlands in 2018-19. Obviously, 2018-19 is a period which predates COVID. Therefore, throughout all of our analysis, there's no effect from COVID, and this represents a more normal or business as usual situation for end-of-life care services. Data is linked for each deceased individual to their activity data occurring in the 2 years prior to their death, where activity data is available and also at a patient level. This gives us a very granular linked patient level data set with a wealth of detail. This data is also available for your local analyst to access. If you would like us to arrange access to the data to help support any local supplementary questions that you may have, then please just contact us to arrange this. Firstly, we're looking to see how the number of deaths has changed over time and how we believe it will change in future. Historically, we see that since 2011, in most years, not all but most, there's been a year-on-year increase in the number of deaths, and also that the gap between genders has been closing. The number of predicted deaths, represented by the dashed lines, and available from the Office of National Statistics, show a continuous and sustained increase in the number of deaths is expected. We also, in the predicted deaths, see males overtaking females for the first time, and male deaths continue higher throughout. So what does this mean? Well, you're already caring for the decedent population and on a continuous basis. As the size of that population grows, so too will the demands on services. Between 2020 and 2030, the size of the decedent population was expected to grow 18%. So in just 10 years, a significant increase in the size of the decedent population. If we look at future decedent populations by age group, we can clearly see the growth in deaths is for those dying when they're older, particularly those aged 85 and over. So the specific needs of older members of the decedent population are going to have a bigger impact on future demand. Moving on now to look at where people die. Overall, 47% of all adult deaths took place in hospital, but that profile does differ for different causes of death. The chart here is called a MECO chart, and it's quite similar to a stacked bar chart. It's similar in that it's got vertical stacked columns, but it differs in that the width of the columns also indicate scale. Here, we see that the largest proportion of deaths, or the widest column, are for those dying from frailty. Within frailty, around a third of all deaths are occurring in a care home. That's the highest proportion for that particular setting, as we'd expect from frailty. Cancer is the next highest group, with around a fifth of all decedents in this category. In cancer, there's the highest proportion of deaths in a hospice, again, as you'd expect, given the nature of hospices providing care for long-term incurable illness. Organ failure and sudden death both have a high proportion dying in hospital, although still approximately a quarter to a third dying at a home location. Other terminal illness is the smallest group within the decedent population, although still quite a large proportion of those dying in hospital. Looking at place of death by deprivation quintiles, we have the most deprived quintile on the left, moving up to the least deprived or most affluent on the right. Between quintiles, there were more deaths in hospital for the most deprived, and that seems to be almost a substitution with deaths in care homes, as the most deprived also had the fewest deaths in a care home setting. For deaths at home and deaths in hospital, they do differ, but they're quite similar across the quintiles. So we now know something about our decedent population. We know how many adults there are and how many are expected in future. We know about their age, their gender, we know about their cause of death and also where they die. But what about the healthcare they access in the 2 years before their death? Before we look at access, I need to mention that in our linked dataset, we've grouped activity into 4 different activity types, which we use throughout our reports. So urgent service events, planned contacts, planned admissions, and bed days. And within these, there are a range of services included. So urgent service events, for example, includes emergency admissions, A&E attendances, and 111 calls. Here, we have the proportion of the decedent population who access each activity type in the 2 years before they die, meaning the proportion of people who have at least one contact with these areas. A large proportion of the decedent population, 95% of people, so nearly everybody, are accessing urgent services at least once. For planned contacts, access was also high, with 87% of people accessing this. Planned admissions, access is lower, around about 40% of the decedent population having one or more of these, and critical care access much lower at 12%. So a small proportion of the decedent population having at least one spell in critical care. And then, by the different services within each activity type, we can see access for emergency admissions and A&E are both high. Each of these are accessed by over 85% of people. For 111, access is much lower, but 64% of the decedent population are picking up the phone and making a call to this service. In planned contacts, the majority of access is coming from access to an outpatient appointment, and nearly a quarter of people in the decedent population having some contact with mental health services. Within planned admissions, it's mainly a mix of day case and electives, with nearly twice as many people accessing day cases than electives. For critical care, we split this into critical care that's the result of an emergency stay or critical care that's the result of an elective stay. So we can see that when people in the decedent population are accessing critical care, it's more often the result of an emergency admission. We've also looked at access for the activity types by cause of death, essentially to see if there was a difference in access for different causes of death. For urgent service events and planned contacts, although access does differ, it's broadly similar between causes of death. However, when we look at planned admissions, it's clear that access is much higher for cancer patients. Also, when we look at critical care, a difference where access is much lower for people dying from frailty. Our final view on people in place is to consider what a person's end of life pathway looks like. Here, we have just one patient with their healthcare represented as a sort of barcode out over the last year of life. The days are at the bottom. These are days before death. The 0 therefore represents the day a person dies, and 365 represents exactly a year before they die. We can see here a patient has a planned admission followed by a planned stay in hospital. They're discharged before they're then later on admitted as an emergency admission, spending around about 2 weeks in hospital. Once discharged, they're having a planned contact and another planned admission, this time without any bed stays, so most likely a day case. Then you can see in the last 4 months, they're having more frequent activity and more emergency care. This particular patient has an emergency admission followed by emergency bed days and actually dies in hospital on day 0. Before, in our example, we've just seen one patient. Here, we're looking at a random sample of 15 from the frailty group. Doing it like this allows us to consider whether there might be any healthcare experiences that are common to people dying from frailty. Here, I would say that in this group, most people at some point are staying in hospital after emergency admission, but not so many people dying in hospital. In the cancer group, it's a much more dense picture, lots more activity happening. They often have a series of planned admissions where they are staying in hospital for a period of time. The urgent events and the associated bed days generally taking place closer to death. Organ failure, quite a lot of urgent stays with this group, and these often becoming longer the closer to death people are. Pathways for sudden death. There are contacts throughout the last year of life, then urgent bed days again cropping up, particularly at the end of life, and often resulting in a death in hospital. The other group, quite a mixed picture, but stands out here that a proportion are having very long lengths of stay, more so towards the end of life. And where we see urgent bed days interrupted by urgent service events, this is representing transfers between trusts or providers. Here, we have the 4 largest cause of death groups together on one slide, just to allow comparison between the different pathways. Thank you for watching this video investigating people and place around end-of-life care. You can find the other videos in this series at www.strategyunitwm.nhs.uk. And again, if you'd like to get in touch, please email us at strategy.unit@nhs.net.